Are you prepared for platformless, serverless SEO on the edge? With Bastian Grimm from Peak Ace. Brought to you by Majestic, I'm David Bain and this is SEO in 2022. Bastian, what is your number one SEO tip for 2022?
Thanks for having me. So yeah, I think one of the things that I'm really excited about is kind of what people refer to as SEO on the edge or platformless SEO. I think it's a fairly interesting topic because, I mean, historically, we have been trying to optimize different systems, right? CMSs, e-commerce platforms, whatever. And that usually requires, resource availability. Obviously, you have to make, business cases. You have to kind of literally fight with different stakeholders, et cetera, right? So it's oftentimes, I think, one of the key challenges in SEO is to actually overcome those and get things implemented in a way. And I think with, SEO on the edge or like serverless SEO, what you actually can do is you can kind of take away a bit of that pain in a way, because you're essentially already implementing certain changes or optimizations, etc., not on the platform itself, but rather on what we call the edge. And the edge kind of refers to, for example, something like Cloudflare, like a CDN like Cloudflare, where they have a technology called Workers, but it's also available or similarly available on other popular CDNs around the globe. And the idea is essentially that you don't necessarily have to do changes on the respective platform, but rather you rely on this technology or the CDN provider that you're using already anyways to get things done. And that can be, especially I think from a perspective of getting things done very, very quickly, be a fantastic solution to not having to wait for, the next iteration of development, for, the next things down the queue, and then you're somewhat after that. Rather, you get things done relatively quickly. And this is actually also why I think this is actually one of the big topics for 2022, because what you can do with it, I think, essentially is that you can use it as a testing ground. So, as I said in my intro, I think one of the key challenges is that oftentimes, SEOs have a hard time making business cases, right? Mm-hmm. And with that, you can actually use the edge to get, stuff been done very, very quickly and then prove the impact, to stakeholders, to management, to whatever. And with that, build your business case and then get a proper implementation done kind of afterwards, right? So this is the idea of why I really think it's a very exciting concept to get us as SEOs moving significantly faster.
So what if an SEO is relatively happy with the platform that they're on? They've got full access to everything. They're generally in control of new platform developments, or at least have a strong say in what's happening, and they can access the server if need be. Is there any real need to consider SEO on the edge for them?
Well, I think yes and no. I mean, in the rare case that you're just describing, because I think from experiences over the last, two decades, I would say, you're rarely done with SEOs and SEO implementation and changes. But certainly, right, if there's a platform that's extremely flexible that you're controlling, there's probably less of a need, right? There is oftentimes, you have it all under control. Everything is going really well. That's fine. However, though, another thing that kind of serverless SEO brings with it is that it's very, very easy to implement. So I was referring to those Cloudflare Workers earlier. And essentially, it's just, a piece of JavaScript. So that means the complexity of creating something is very, very small. And even with very, let's say, limited, development skills or development expertise, you can get quick fixes done, literally within 10 minutes. So you need to create your couple of lines of code. You hit the workers deploy button and it's done, right? So in most cases, I would say that you are significantly slower, even if you're under full control of the, the release planning and whatnot. If you just want to do things very, very quickly, that's one way. I think the other benefit that it also brings is that it's extremely powerful, not only for kind of classic SEO things or fixes in a way. You could, for example, also use it for testing. And I think one of the things that we're doing as SEOs, probably still not like good enough or like at a scale that it's sufficient, let's put it that way, is split testing for SEO purposes. And I think you could do that using workers, for example, with very, very small kind of implementation effort. And I think this is also a really nice, it has like a bunch of different use cases, a very nice kind of way as to how to benefit from that technology, really without having to do much else.
So is this something that all SEOs need to be aware of, or is it only SEOs and enterprises we're talking about here?
I think certainly, the larger the organization gets, the more, complexity it has in a way that, there's, different departments, as we said, like different stakeholders, there's political things, and those organizations, unfortunately, oftentimes just move slower. So I think there's a huge benefit for those. However, also a bit of a, downside in a way that you need to maybe, there's topics like compliance that you're dealing with on enterprise level at some point. Those things you need to be aware of. But, even if you have smaller sites, you could use it. There was a recent use case that we've been kind of utilizing workers for a lot, also on smaller platforms with Shopify, because Shopify up until recently only had, they didn't really allow you to change the robots text file, which I consider to be somewhat, a basic thing, right? But you
we'll
couldn't
have to see Kevin Indig really, about that.
Yeah, exactly, right. You couldn't really be doing this without relying on additional tech. And if you had a Shopify platform, but you had Cloudflare before, it was super easy to do that on the fly. So it's not necessarily only for large and small. I think it just really depends on what kind of situation and setup you're dealing with, and then how you could, incorporate that to help you just be more efficient, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I remember dealing with SEO for big commercial sites that ran on CMSs from many years ago, and they couldn't even do basic things like change certain title tags in different pages. So it'd be very useful for things like that. So you mentioned testing and you using it for that. What are a few examples of very specific elements that this technology will be used for? And also in relation to that, what are some aspects of SEO that you definitely wouldn't use platformless SEO for?
I mean, the beauty of, and also the danger, I guess, at the same time with workers or like just generally kind of SEO on the edge is the fact that you have, literally speaking, full access to everything. So, whatever you can think of that you want to test, you can test, because, the way it works is before the response is being sent back to your browser, like you being the visitor, like this full HTML, but also not only HTML, including basically the headers and whatnot, you have access to. So that, that means, kind of to answer your question, I mean, I could test everything and anything from, different title tag variations, which is probably a very, simple thing, down to more complex things. Let's say I build, 2 clusters of different category pages, and one, I change the item count, or I add a certain type of content, or I remove a certain type of content. I can move, HTML elements around, etc., etc. So you are fairly limitless in that regard. So it more comes down to what do you really want to test. And I think this is really cool, because it gives you all the access to all the elements. But again, then the I said it's also a bit of a danger, and that is, I think, true, because if you are modifying things on the edge that are implemented differently on your platform, the shop or the CMS or whatever, that can also kind of introduce conflicting code, for example, and might produce like unforeseen behavior, right? So I think it's super important that even though you have this, and I really think it's kind of a weapon if you use it well, and if you do it properly. I think it's very much important to have proper communication, make stakeholders aware that there are certain things being done, that are somewhat like all of a sudden happening at a different place. I think this is very, very important to know.
Okay, so if an SEO is just discovering this really for the first time and thinking, actually, I could really utilize this in the business that I work in, what are a few initial first steps that they need to do to become more aware of it? And what are a few of the first things that they should probably test with that they can get the quickest wins from?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need somewhat a bit of technical experience, but not too much, which is one thing that I really like about it, because essentially, as I said, the technology in case of Cloudflare, it's different for other platforms, but in case of Cloudflare, is essentially JavaScript. They have a very, very well documented kind of section on the Cloudflare homepage that gives you like an info on like, APIs and functionality, and including a lot of like, they call it the Cloudflare Workers Playground, a lot of like pre-made code samples. So I gave a talk recently about that. The entry into the topic is relatively straightforward. So you need a Cloudflare account, which is essentially free if you so it's no promo, like it's just free for everyone until a certain size, and then you need to be kind of somewhat a bit familiar with JavaScript, so you can kind of modify at least like the ready-made examples. And then again, I think what I would be starting with, just to understand the complexity, have access or try to access some basic elements like page titles or meta descriptions, or like paragraphs with content, and modify them on the fly and see what comes out of it. With this Workers Playground, it's super easy because you can essentially deploy everything just in a testing stage, and you can see like the real world output before you do anything. It's a fairly straightforward approach, and there's been a lot of like discussions and posts about it recently. I think one of the platforms that I like to suggest for this implementation is actually called Sloth. So it's kind of a meta CMS, if you so will. So essentially, it's a code creator for workers. So if you don't want to write, I enjoy kind of writing this myself because I know then what's happening, what does the code do, right? But you could also have them support you in creating the functionality based on workers that you actually really want. So various ways, but I think barrier-wise, it's fairly easy to get into it.
So what are your general thoughts on best practice for page title and meta description at the moment? So if someone wanted to automatically generate those on the fly, obviously things could get messy. What are some good practice tips that work really effectively at the moment?
Yeah, the reason why I'm laughing, I'm sure you already have guessed, is that there's obviously, I think just last week of us recording this, a lot of like, update chatter around Google dealing with, page titles differently and kind of using, values from headlines and like even anchor text and all of that. So I think for me on page titles, I think the biggest thing that we still see with a lot of platforms is that they're just creating internal duplication in various ways, forms and formats. So I would certainly just make sure that my page titles are still unique. That, I mean, of course, you have certain kind of keyword inclusion. Again, it goes back to what we've been saying, I think, for years and years and years, and hasn't really changed. I mean, it's not a list of keywords. It's not keyword stuffing them for the sake of it, but just like have them being relevant, make them click friendly, make them kind of take care of readability in a way. That hasn't really changed that much. And if Google decides to, for whatever reason, rewrite your titles, then maybe they haven't been really great in the first place. So that's something that you probably should revisit. Anyways, and I think for that it's great because you can just, for different sections or categories or whatever type of selection you decide on, you can test different types, right? Do you want them to be a bit longer? Do you want them to be a bit shorter? Do you want to kind of move the brand to the end or not? Those are the things that you can really test relatively quickly. I think the issue with testing is that people really need to understand that it's like you can't test on a one-on-one basis. You need to build groups, either different types of the same type of traffic or different types, but somewhat otherwise comparable. This is very important. Otherwise, the results won't tell you much, but I think that is like the easiest way to get into it. Okay,
and I've done a little bit of test and learns in terms of trying different things and seeing what has improved things. And obviously you need a decent amount of data and, as you say, be testing the same things. What are your just general initial thoughts on the amount of time or the amount of eyeballs that need to be seen on, for example, a page title before we get statistical relevance and we can actually say for certain that something has actually performed better?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the biggest topics in any type of, like, you know, A/B or split testing, right? When does it reach the respective relevancy that you actually need, right? And of course, I mean, it's not possible for you really to test, you know, something with 100 visitors or something. I mean, you might see a result, but is that really relevant? That's a good question, right? Probably not. So that's why I said, like, I would rather go and say build, like, you know, chunks of pages that somewhat are the same. So I don't know, like 20, you know, in one bucket, and then 20 in another, and 20 in another, you know, somewhat like this. But also, you know, make sure that they are, it's like somewhat comparable in terms of traffic. Then there's big, you know, problems, or, you know, big topic is seasonality, right? So, you know, this is something that needs to be considered in tests as well. When do you test and what do you test? So, yeah, it certainly is nothing for, you know, in e-com that sells maybe 10, 15 products and only has a couple of hundred visitors. That might not be statistically relevant. As for duration, you know, I think what also needs to be considered from that standpoint, obviously, is that, you know, Google needs to recrawl, they need to reprocess things, et cetera, et cetera. So don't make the mistake of just ending those tests too early. That usually is also something that won't work. Different to when you do regular user testing, right? There it doesn't really matter. But for us to kind of reassign rankings, et cetera, you know, that takes longer in the time span than it takes for just a regular kind of platform split testing, for example.
It's a big topic, isn't it? So it's very difficult to cover in a single answer. But
very true.
Thanks for sharing that there. But just to finish up, if an SEO wants to spend more time on developing SEO on the edge, and they're very busy at the moment, what's one thing that they have been doing over the last few years that is probably not a good use of their time, that they need to perhaps consider stopping doing now to spend more time on these kinds of activities that we've been discussing?
Well, I think what really fascinates me actually is that there's still a lot of people that really somewhat, like I like to call it, chase the algorithm, or I think probably more accurate would be chase the algorithms. I mean, we're not dealing with one single one. I think the opposite is true. But honestly, I'd rather really not do that and focus on the stuff that I somewhat can control. So I think I would very much like kind of move away from this somewhat reactive SEO in a way, right? So running, you know, after every trend that I see somewhat out there is probably not the best use of time anyways. So I'd rather be proactive and kind of start using this. As I said, like, I think the best case as to why you would use Edge SEO right now is just test out things very, very quickly, build like a rough implementation, see what it does. If it works, fantastic, make your case, roll it out into the platform. And for that, I think you can certainly sacrifice time on, trying to, chase the algorithms, try to see what did they really do, because if they did that, them being Google, might already be too late anyways. So I'd rather be proactive and not so much reactive, if that makes any sense.
Great stuff. Absolutely, yes. Well, you can find Bastian Grimm over at pa.ag. Bastian, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2022.
Thank you very much for having me.
Check out the rest of the content from SEO in 2022 over at SEOin2022.com.